to have you here as we offer from here at The Scent an opportunity to look at our holidays a little bit differently this year. Some folks might be struggling with maybe the holidays don't feel quite as joyous as they usually do. Or maybe you're just having one of those moments where you say, is what I'm feeling normal or not? Today we are really fortunate to be able to have Chris Gevaert joining us. Now, Chris usually sits on the other side of our cameras and offers us some computer expertise and so on as we continue our journeys together. But today we're going to get him to sit on this side of the camera. Chris's experience comes from his work as a social worker and one of the lead counselors for the Heart and Soul Project of the Windsor Chapel community. We're excited to have him here, and we hope that you'll get some more information from him this afternoon as we continue our journey together. For right now, I would invite you to just pause for a moment as Chris offers a few thoughts on how we can grieve our way through the holidays this coming year.
Well, I'm really happy to be here with you today. It's strangely enough odd being on this side of the camera, so I'm usually behind the lights, so it's a lot brighter on this side. Very grateful for the opportunity, and whenever I have the opportunity to talk about grief, death, and dying, it actually pleases me, and I know it sounds a little bit odd, but it's a topic we seldom cover and talk about in society. It's one that we need to address more and more because, as I say, death is as much a part of life as birth is. And so it's important that we take these times, these moments, to realize that death is a natural part of our life and how we can best appropriate it, how we can best relate to it as a natural part of living. So a series of questions have been submitted, and we're just going to go about asking those questions and common questions that happen around how we handle grief through the holidays.
So Chris, our first question is, why is grief significant, particularly at this time of year?
Yeah, it's one of the number one questions. My caseload actually picks up a lot in the months of November and December leading up to the holidays, simply because it is an emotionally rich holiday that we celebrate. Whether, everybody's kind of coming together, the Christmas music goes on, the Christmas lights go up, and it's a reminder, yet another reminder. Now, it's not the only reminder throughout the year, but certainly it is probably one of the most poignant reminders where the entirety of society is singing love and joy, and we feel something otherwise. So we ask the question, is there something wrong with me? I don't want to celebrate. So Christmas is a very intensely emotional time for everybody, but more particularly for those who are grieving.
So if somebody is in that midst of grieving and so on, what if they don't feel like doing Christmas stuff?
Again, another great question. What if I don't want to do Christmas this year? Simple answer, then really don't, but do. Now that sounds contradictory. Don't celebrate Christmas because it's not going to be celebrated the same anyways this year. We can't change the reality that Christmas will look a little bit, feel a little bit, and be a little bit different this year. So the difficulty comes in, do I just lock myself up for the next 2 months if we begin November and December and kind of emerge in the springtime? Well, that's not always so good either, but I think we can ask ourselves some fundamental questions about what we need to participate or how long we need to participate, if at all. But it's about measuring the amount of energy that we have to give. I've often used the example of a bank account. We all know how much we have to spend in our financial bank accounts. We know how much we have to spend on Christmas, and we hope to not go into debt. I'd like to liken it to the amount of emotional energy that we have in our emotional bank accounts. Can we spend? Do we have enough to spend on what we would normally do? And I'm going to suggest, if you're watching this, probably not. So we have to measure what we want to spend our emotional bank account on.
So when we're talking about that emotional bank account, sometimes it's things that we see that trigger those emotions. What about decorations? Should we decorate or should we not decorate? What should we do about celebrating the Christmas season?
So one of the keys is learning what you want to dedicate your energy to. Decorations tend to be the one that doesn't match with what's going on the inside. Now, there's an expression that everybody will grieve, not everybody will mourn. And the difference between grief and mourning is grief is something that's going to happen whether you like it to or not. Whenever we lose something or someone, whether it's a loss of a job, a divorce, or death itself, we are going to feel grief. But what mourning does, and this is what the church does particularly well, is offer an outward expression of what's going on the inside. So the question about decorating is it might not match what's going on the inside. But is there another way that we can decorate that includes and allows for room and space for the acknowledgement of the absence, but also the continued presence of our loved ones? So for instance, one of the examples I suggested to one person, they were telling me about how loving, how loyal, how caring her father was, how generous and sharing he was. And I said, well, one thing you might consider doing is going to the local store and buying some blank Christmas bulbs and getting one of those fine markers and write those qualities about him and hang it on your tree as a testimony to his presence. It's not that we have to do things the same way, but we need to be creative with our mourning and sometimes with our decorating. Now, if you don't feel like decorating at all, that's fine too. It's basically responding to what the needs are from your emotional self. So learning how to balance what's socially expected by other people, but also what resources you have to give to that kind of energy.
So when you talk about the social expectations of grieving and the social expectations of mourning, what about those events that go on throughout the church or throughout the Christmas season? Things that we really just don't feel like attending and feel that we have to.
Right. So like dinners and family get-togethers and functions. Now, strangely enough, I think we've been all experiencing a corporate grief over the past 2 years, I guess it's been, since we've had these lockdowns and isolations. It's really forced us to change the way we do things, but death does it on its own. So the question is what if I don't feel like going to my brother's place for dinner or to a work function? Well, again, we go back to that idea of the emotional bank account. What are some things, and I mean, this is where planning can help out. What are some things that I really think I want to go to? That's the one pile. Things that I have to go to, and the things that I just don't have to and don't want to go to. I remember the first year after my brother died, I was saying to my counselor, I'm falling behind in all I have to do. I haven't had time to fill out my Christmas cards. And he says, well, then don't send them. And I haven't sent a Christmas card in 20 years. And it feels good because I realized I didn't have to take that energy to do what I've always done. Same thing with dinners. Figure out the ones that you want to, but also have a plan for those ones you make a decision. Make a decision to find your own way there so that if you need to, you can get up and leave. Maybe you're not going to spend the whole night. Maybe you're not going to wait till midnight on New Year's Eve for the falling of the ball and the striking of midnight. Maybe you come up with a plan of how much you can tolerate in your emotional bank account given. And I'm going to be quite honest with you, you're not going to be able to do everything that you used to do because the emotional requirements, and that's okay.
So when you're talking about things like the emotional bank, but more specifically about not staying for the whole event, about not staying until the ball drops and stuff, what happens if I'm at a social event and I just feel my emotions are getting the better of me? I don't want to be crying at a Christmas event. I don't want to be crying at New Year's Eve. How do I avoid being a wet blanket?
Well, and this is something that I tell grievers. The problem isn't with the griever. The problem is with the world around. And that's one of the things that I often say is the world needs to see more tears. We do an annual event where we invite the people we have served in the community, and there are over almost 1,000 families we serve, and only a third of them come. And the hall is filled with 1,000 people. Back in the days we could have this. And one of the things people remark about is, I'm not alone in this. One of the things that we can recognize is that your tears are not your enemies. And I get it. Not all of us like to be crying in our public spaces, but having couple things, maybe an opportunity to excuse yourself, but it's okay if you cry and be honest. It's the issue is with other people being able to receive the reality of your lived situation, your emotional requirements. So, but also again knowing your limits, because one of the things grief is for sure is incredibly exhausting. So knowing that what you think you can provide, knowing that you might just need to excuse yourself politely, and any guest, any host would certainly appreciate that if it's a party worth going to.
Now, I've had a number of folks who have asked about that second year question. So, my loved one has been gone for a couple of years now, and people keep telling us that the second year is going to be easier, but it just doesn't feel that way. Is that normal?
Yeah, so I'm going to say this twice, I'm going to repeat it. There is no timeline for grief, and I'm going to say it again. There is no timeline for grief. Grief takes on its own shape and its own speed, and you can have identical twins whose dad dies, let's say. They are each going to have a grief reaction as unique as their own fingerprints. So some days, some years might be better, and some years it might not be. In fact, if I can relate personally, it's going to be 21 years that my brother has died on the 21st of this month. And every year around this time of year, I feel the tinge and the heaviness of sadness, the memories that come back, what we've missed. And that's okay. I've learned to incorporate it. Some years, I don't give it much thought. And other years, like this year, I'm giving it more thought. So recognizing that there is no timeline of grief. Some people will say the second year is harder. Some people will say the first year. What allows people to get through the experience of grief is their honesty with their emotions. Journaling, being with other grief buddies, I call them, finding a good grief buddy, somebody who's not going to should all over you. You should do this or you should do that, but somebody who's going to listen to your story and receive the goodness and the kindness of that story. Because here's the reality. We don't say goodbye to our loved ones. We continue the relationship. Anybody worth their salt in grief work will recognize that continuing the relationship with our loved one is just as important now as ever. So finding somebody who wants to hear stories, finding somebody who wants to share their name, say their name, acknowledge their presence, that's going to be what helps you process the grief. We don't get over, we don't close the door, we process and we work and we walk with our grief.
Thanks, Chris. So, what's the point where we realize that it's time to go and talk to someone? What is it that's just seasonal stuff, and what is it when we realize this is more than just Christmas grief? This is something else going on.
Yeah, so there is a term called complicated grief disorder or prolonged grief disorder, and it resembles depression, but it's a little bit different than depression. Typically, I don't like calling the work I do grief counseling. I call it grief support, because we're just providing strategies, tools, and tips for dealing with a normal reaction to a life event. But where it becomes complicated, and the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the fancy name for the book that has all the mental health disorders, and it says that if it's over 6 months and you find yourself not being able to get out of bed, not being able to carry on your daily activities of living, if you're not going out for walks, your health is deteriorating, it might be time to look into dealing with some of that with a professional, and there are a number of good professionals in the community. But one thing that I have found is incredibly beneficial for what we call normative grief, and even complicated grief or traumatic grief, is our grief groups. Now, unfortunately, they are limited in the city, but What's so great about the grief groups in my experience is I can accomplish more in 8 weeks than I can in a year of working with a client, simply because people are working with strangers, and there's a lot of head nodding going on, meaning that I'm not alone in this experience of loss, this experience of grief. So finding a good grief group would help as well. But certainly if it's where people are noticing perhaps you're coping using more alcohol than you normally would, it's probably a sign that it's time to get some professional help.
Very good. Well, thank you, Chris. So we're here, it's approaching Christmas time, it's that season, all the lights are up, all the decorations are up, all the carols are being played on the radio, and yet it just doesn't feel the same as it used to. Will Christmas ever be the same again?
Much like our liturgical year, even though we go over the same cycle of 3 years, year A, B, and C, over and over again, it's never the same because we're always different. Now, notably, if we've been spending 40 years with our loved one and they die, it's going to be incredibly different. But Christmas is never the same. I think we've experienced that as a corporate global community with this pandemic. This pandemic has been a form of grief for the whole world. Things don't go back to the way they were, and sometimes they shouldn't. Now, it doesn't mean we won't adapt. What we do is we don't close off, we don't try to go back to the way things were, but we adapt. We learn how to deal and process and grow with our loss. In fact, so much so that the loss can actually become a teacher in other areas of our life. If we think grief is just isolated to death, it is not. I mean, when our first child is born, there's an element of grief because our life has changed forever. And not in a bad way, of course, but our lives are constantly changing. So in answer to that question, Christmas is never the same. Christmas is always evolving and changing. And I often liken it, again, to like our liturgical year. It's more like water that seeps into the soil. It goes deeper and deeper and deeper and nourishes in different ways. And it actually helps us grow. So grief can actually be a product for our growth.
Excellent. So one last question for you, and it's really, I think, just your own personal opinion. Is there anything else that we should be aware of? Are there triggers we should look out for? Are there concerns that we should be aware of as we make our way through? And what might some of your hints be to us to get through the season?
Yeah. Don't be afraid of tears. Tears are the words of the soul. They're sometimes what allow us to feel refreshed and renewed. Sometimes we can't put into words what we need to, and sometimes the tears do exactly that. Again, I can appreciate that not everybody wants to do that publicly, but finding a safe place. Journaling is helpful. Continuing the conversation, finding ways to communicate with your loved one. Certainly in the what I have found an incredible help is people who belong to spiritual communities, finding a connection through there, because there's quite a natural fit of grief in with our Christian story as well. The Christian story manages and understands and appreciates the role of grief, because even Jesus wept at the death of his friend Lazarus. So if it's good enough for God, it must be good enough for us. I wouldn't worry too much about the people who don't want to grieve with you. And they can be sometimes the ones who are closest. Maybe it's a child saying, oh, let's get rid of dad's clothing. Let's get rid of... You know what? You don't have to do anything. Don't let anybody shit on you. You might not find the support where you think you need it, but there are other people, especially in grief groups and otherwise, that might want to share your story. We run a seasonal walking group, and we get together every Wednesday and go for a walk, and it's very informal, but everybody knows there that it's a safe place to mention your loved one's name and to talk if you want to talk, but at least we're getting out and having exercise. So that's certainly a big help as well.
Excellent. Just one last thing. You talked about being connected to a spiritual community and the power and importance of that. I know that the Scent is going to be offering a Blue Christmas, a longest night service on the 21st of December. What kind of things do you feel are important spiritually for us to acknowledge when we're in these moments of grief, especially at a season in the church year that is so joyful and so expectant.
Well, I always love how the informal start, how the world tends to start celebrating Christmas at the beginning of November, and we are as a church busy celebrating, actually celebrating death and new life, with All Saints Day, All Souls Day, and the like. But there's something really powerful in the litany of the saints. We say the saints' names. Saint Joseph, pray for us. Saint Patrick, pray for us. Why not, as part of our traditions, include our loved one's name as part of the communion of saints and say their name? One of the things I'll often say if I'm leading a funeral service at the funeral home is the flowers won't honor these people anymore. Flowers won't honor these people. Worldly titles won't honor these people. Money won't honor these people. If you wish to honor them, honor the legacy of their kindness, honor the legacy of their Christian goodness, and say their name. If you go into a cemetery, that's the one thing they take with them, and it's marking their graves, is their name. So I would suggest on the longest night is maybe honoring them by saying their name and lighting a candle and acknowledging their presence. One thing one family told me they did at their Christmas dinner is they set Dad's place. Nobody sat at it. Much like waiting for Elijah, they lit a candle as a symbol of hope. And they acknowledged the presence. It doesn't have to be as bold as that, but we can acknowledge their presence even as we attempt to celebrate. So that's what I would probably suggest.
Well, that's wonderful. Thanks, Chris. If folks are still struggling a little bit, is it all right if they reach out to the Cent and connect to you and
yeah, of course,
and look for some advice?
And one of the things I often recommend too is there are many fine workers out there. CMHA has a great program, but like anything, everything is sort of taxed. But you can certainly reach out to the Cent, to one of your pastors. I'd be more than happy to take some time to sit and talk with you. We do have an 8-week group. I'm almost hesitant to say this, but it does fill up fast in February. That we have our walking groups. You can reach out to them and certainly look for us online. We have a monthly seminar. Our next seminar is on pandemic grief. We have on continuing the bonds with different topics throughout the year too. So certainly they can reach out to you if they want to get my information.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
So remember, everyone, if you're needing that quiet moment, if you're needing that moment where the world just gets blocked away and you have a moment to sit in silence and name those names and sit in that presence of what's different this year, feel free to join us at our longest night service on December 21st. That's tonight at 7 p.m. And of course, it will be on our YouTube channel as well, and you can find that anytime you need it over the course of the holiday. Thank you so much, Chris. It's been wonderful to have you share with us, and we certainly appreciate your ministry, both on this side of the camera and on that side. And we thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.